May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So, what do you do when you get a little nervous? Giggle. Giggle. Maybe tap your foot. Maybe sort of look around. Scratch here. And what happens when you get into a conversation or a situation you really don't want to be in? Really don't. Go to the bathroom. Or, it's hot out today, isn't it? Yeah, my air conditioning's not working so good. It's really hot out there. My second day of clinical pastoral education, when I was in seminary, I was sent on my very first visitation in the hospital. We had had one day of sort of orientation and training, and then they were like, all right, here's your floors. Good luck, chaplains. See you at lunch. Well, after I sort of sat in the waiting room for a really long time and tried to collect myself, I went up to the floor, and I had a list of people and their religious affiliations, and as I was headed on the floor, one of the nurses caught me and said, there's a lady who really wants to see a chaplain. Well, let me call one for you. But my badge said chaplain, even though my brain and heart said terrified. So I went into the ladies' room, and the nurse had said she's just received a diagnosis of liver cancer, and her prognosis is really not very good. Which made me go back to the waiting room for about 20 more minutes before I got myself together. And I went in, and I had practically every nervous tic I'd ever had in my entire life in that moment. I must have looked like Nomar Garcia Parra, like pulling the gloves and tapping my bat, and I was a complete and utter wreck. And introduced myself as the chaplain and tried to have a conversation. We were supposed to have deep, meaningful, God-centered conversations. Only this lady was having none of it. And we had a really difficult conversation where I was completely inadequate and left the room feeling like I had done very little good. And I think I had probably done really very little good. The disciples in this morning's gospel lesson are essentially doing exactly the same thing I was doing in that poor lady's room. They've just heard the second of Jesus' predictions of his death and his resurrection, but they're ignoring that part at this point. They're totally stuck on the death part. The first passion prediction was in the gospel lesson we read last Sunday. We hear the second one this Sunday. So what do? Mark tells us they're too afraid to ask Jesus what he means. Why? Because after the first passion prediction, when Peter was brave enough to say something, Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." And they're looking at each other going, "I'm not saying anything. You saying? I'm not saying anything. Look what happened to Peter." So what do? They start arguing about something completely useless and inconsequential. Because think about it. Jesus is not some great powerful ruler. He doesn't have a lot of money. He doesn't own any property. He's an itinerant rabbi, completely dependent on the goodwill of the people that he comes in contact with. And he's the one in charge. Now we've got the rest of them behind him, and they're arguing who's greatest. I mean, it's like, well, who's the greatest of the least? Your leader, the one who you think is supposed to be powerful and in charge and taking care of you, has just told you he's going to be killed. And now you're arguing who's the greatest. They might as well have been talking about the weather, or how far they had to walk, or whether they were going to eat that day. Jesus has just revealed to them this huge piece of his life and ministry, his knowledge of what is to come. And they just can't talk about anything important. And they're too afraid to ask him, and they're too afraid to really ask each other. And so they end up in this completely useless conversation about who is greatest. And Jesus actually, I think, takes some pity on his disciples in this particular story. He doesn't sort of roll his eyes and go, "Oh, again?" And even though they're trying to hide their conversation from him, I'm sure he's sort of hearing some murmurings in the background, and he has a gist of what's going on. But he takes pity on them. Maybe he understands their fears. Maybe he recognizes how hard this is for them to hear these words that he's saying. And so he decides to teach them a bit of a lesson. And he brings a child into their midst. And then he turns their world completely upside down. Everything they thought they knew about power and authority and wealth and God, he pretty much wipes that away in all of about 2 sentences and tells them everything you thought you knew is not true. But he's been doing that all along. Because all along he has not been in the places of power and the places of wealth. All along he has not been looking for those people who might be his patron, who could make his life comfortable. All along Jesus has been looking and serving and ministering with those that no one cares about and no one really sees. Those who are essentially invisible. And so what Jesus is saying to them, in saying you must be the servant of all, the greatest of all is the servant of all. He's saying everything you thought you knew, when it comes to God's kingdom, God's reign, God's life, everything you thought you knew is not right. I'm teaching you something new, something dramatically different. And I think Jesus, as he so often does, is sort of coming around in a backdoor teaching as well. Because I think what he is saying to them, and what he's speaking to them about, in addition to humility, is faithfulness. Jesus has been faithful to his ministry among those with no authority, no power, those who are invisible. And while the disciples still haven't quite caught all the way up with Jesus yet, he's reminding them again of what he's been trying to say to them. He's reminding them that finding yourself in the place of wealth and power is not the place where you're going to find God. Where you're going to find God is your faithfulness to what is small, what is insignificant, what other people pay no attention to, think has no worth or value. That is the place where God is going to be found. That indeed is actually the place where you will find life and health and vibrancy. The disciples just got so caught in the fear of what Jesus was saying, so uncomfortable with what that might mean for them, that they couldn't quite get to the point. They couldn't talk with Jesus about this amazing thing he had just told them. And so Jesus gathers them in and says, I'm reminding you that the places of power are not the places of life. The places of wealth are not the places of life. The places of being with those who are invisible, those that no one cares about, those that are among the least. Being faithful to those places is where we will find God. It took the disciples a long time to get there. They did finally arrive there, but it took them quite a while. They actually had to go through Jesus' death and resurrection before they got there on their own. And so I think our gospel lesson is inviting our own reflection in these places. How we live out our own faithfulness to God. Where do we find maybe our fear in the way, and where do we need to push that aside? Where do we see those who are invisible or unimportant? Where is God inviting us to open our eyes a little bit wider and see the world around us? Amen.